Stay Compliant, a guide to the General Product Safety Directive, the GPSD, for EU manufacturers and distributors. In this video, we'll be discussing the General Product Safety Directive, GPSD, which requires producers to place only safe products on the European market. This directive applies to most consumer products in Europe and set out safety requirements, although it's not a CE marking directive. As a manufacturer or distributor in the EU, it's crucial to understand the different directives and standards that apply to your products to meet GPSD requirements. European harmonized standards are the recommended method of safety assessments in Europe, and compliance and regulatory agency can help prevent mistakes. To ensure compliance, you need to identify relevant directives and standards, establish whether your product complies, and obtain certificate or evidence of conformity. Finally, mark your product with the CE symbol to show compliance with relevant European product directives and standards. Let's delve into the details with Nadine, our HIMIS and Compliance Officer, as she explained the General Product Safety Directive and how it applies to consumer products in Europe. Get ready to learn.
Hi again. So in this lesson, we're going to dive more into the GPSD, which is the General Product Safety Directive. We touched on it in our previous lesson, but let's get into a bit more detail. As I've said, the GPSD is an umbrella which applies to most consumer products within Europe. This directive, which has been in place since 2001, states that producers are obliged to place only safe products on the market. The GPSD sets out safety requirements for all consumer products being placed on the European market, but unlike other European directives, the GPSD is not a CE marking directive. The General Product Safety Directive does not require the CE marking to be affixed on the product, but uses many of the same principles for proving compliance. It applies to products which are not covered by a specific sector legislation, such as furniture, textiles, child use and care articles, bicycles, and so on. So, as a manufacturer or a distributor in the EU, you need to make sure you're aware of the different directives and standards which apply to your products to ensure you're meeting the GPSD requirements. Have you heard of the European Harmonized Standards? These standards are a recommended method of undertaking a safety assessment in Europe. In short, they are a way for you to ensure your product meets the GPSD requirements. That being said, there are other options available to you, like using European Commission guidelines and applying product safety codes of good practice. You can view the list of harmonized standards on the European Commission's website. The directive is a self-assessment with no requirement to involve a third party, although you could use one to your own discretion. So, how can you apply this knowledge? What does this mean for you? Most importantly, it means that you have a responsibility to identify the directives and standards which apply to your product. This is much easier and cost-effective when you enlist a compliance and regulatory agency that can handle this for you to help you prevent mistakes. Once you have established these directives and standards, you need to establish whether your product complies to these standards, whether you're the manufacturer or the distributor. In the cases where the certificates are not available, you may need to involve a third-party laboratory to get these done. Before you decide to use a certain lab for testing services though, there are a few things which you need to check. Firstly, do they have the correct accreditation for carrying out tests, calibrations, or even sampling? In most cases, the ISO or IEC 17025 accreditation will cover this. Secondly, are they accredited to carry out the particular standard requirements? So, do they understand the standard and test parameters, and do they have the correct equipment? Thirdly, how much will these tests cost? A lab in the UK could charge about $15,000 for a test which costs $5,000 in Spain. Once you've established all this and decided on your particular lab, the next step is to send a sample to the laboratory. The lab will provide all the details pertaining to how much of a sample is required and how the sample needs to be presented. If your product passes the test, the lab will issue a certificate or evidence of conformity. After receiving the certificate, you'll need to draw up the signed EU document of conformity, also called the ECDOC. Another must for Europe is to mark your product with the CE symbol to show that the product fulfills the requirement of relevant European product directives and that it meets all the requirements of the relevant recognized European Harmonized Performance and Safety Standard. All directives can be found on the European Commission's website. You'll also find the standards and legislations which are applicable to your product. Remember, in some cases, your product might be so unique that the standards are not available. If this is the case with your product, don't stress. I'll advise you on what steps you need to take in the section where we discuss testing standards. But that's it for now. Let's continue.